I'm Suzanne Leighton. I live in Cape Town, where I was born. I am a complementary practitioner, and I have been working with aromatherapy and reflexology and other hands-on healing forms of art since my children were born. Before that, I was a civil engineer, working with computers and project management, and also in education with computer systems. So while I was working in the field of engineering, I had a hobby of yoga and aromatherapy and massage, in which I became professionally trained. And when my two daughters were born 13 years ago and 12 years ago, I moved into becoming a practitioner in the healing arts as a full-time job. Soon after my second daughter was born, I had my first hypomanic attack, very suddenly and with no forewarning. And I've been dealing with bipolar disorder, which used to be called manic depression, since then, which is about 11 years. And my reason for speaking about it is because it's a scary illness. It's a bit unknown. It's a mental illness, so there's a lot of taboo about it, and I would rather talk about it and generate discussion than hide it away in the cupboard. So I want to destigmatize and to demystify bipolar disorder, which is my reason for speaking about it. Bipolar disorder used to be called manic depression. And it's a very complicated, intricate condition because it's different in everybody. But generally speaking, it's classified into a couple of areas, so I'd like to just highlight those. There's bipolar 1, which is when you have high manic attacks as well as very low, deep depressions. You can also have mixed episodes, which means you can be manic and depressed at the same time. But the extremes are high and low, and that's called bipolar 1. Bipolar 2 is when you don't go quite so high, you have hypomanic attacks, but you do go into the depths of depression. Then there's rapid cycling, which means you can have any episode, up, down, or mixed, but you're having about 4 in a year, so that's often. And they also have something called schizoaffective disorder, which is your mania and your depression combined with psychosis, which means hallucinations. And then there's cyclothymia, which is up manic, but not very high, so it's hypomanic, and depressions, but not terrible, dark, deep, black hole depression. So it's a slightly less severe case. I'd like to spend quite a lot of time talking about mania rather than depression, because I think depression has been quite well covered in the literature and discussions and possibly in people's understanding, and that I believe it's the manic side of this illness which maybe needs to be talked about, but also because that's more my experience. So what actually does bipolar look like? So I've said we understand the depression. Let me talk a little bit about what manic symptoms are. And not everybody has these symptoms, and you don't have to have all of them in order to be manic. So what it is fast, getting faster and faster until it's very out of control. Usually fast thinking, fast talking, fast moving, lack of focus, lack of concentration, things getting a little bit hectic and frenetic. What happens also is that you often spend money that you don't have, you become sexually promiscuous, you start becoming very willful, having delusions of grandeur, thinking that you can do things which maybe physically you are unable to do. You're very disruptive, you can have feelings of being persecuted, high anxiety, you can even be paranoid. Certainly hallucinations can accompany this as well, especially if you start running down, you're not eating, you're not sleeping, and so your body actually starts really not functioning very well. And you are becoming extremely frustrated with everyone else because they're all going really ploddingly slowly, whereas you're racing ahead. They become extremely frustrated with you because you are pushing and you're being demanding and willful, and so communication starts breaking down. People do all kinds of things. You'll hear stories about people who get divorced or get remarried or jump in their cars and drive to Johannesburg overnight and don't eat and don't sleep and do all kinds of crazy things that are actually very detrimental to themselves. So it's not only in the depths of a depression that you can commit suicide or harm yourself in some way. It can also be at the other end of the mania that you can hurt yourself really badly. So it is a very dangerous and potentially fatal condition. There are a lot of people in our general community that suffer from it. They say about 2%. I have a feeling that it could be higher because it's a mental illness and also there's no means of measuring it, that a lot of cases go undiagnosed. Mainly because people don't know what it is. They don't know that there's a problem. It's habitual, maybe it's in the family, so they don't see it necessarily as an illness. And also because it's a little bit a sign of our times. So we live in a time where being creative, doing things, multitasking is actually often a norm, so that it's not seen as extraordinary. People suffer from burnout. They don't necessarily acknowledge or anybody would recognize that they were having a nervous breakdown or that actually they were having a collapse after a manic attack. So it's not necessarily recognized. Talking a little bit about myself, maybe to put it into context, and actually that's all I can really talk about. I can relate to you from the textbooks about what the symptoms are, but what happened to me when I was manic was I would slowly start getting faster and faster. Now this is an interesting time because when you initially start going faster, everything speeds up. It's actually quite exciting. It's very productive, it's very creative. Everything is bigger and bolder and you get very enthusiastic about things. So whatever you're doing, you do better and faster and more creatively than you've done before. And I think that's why it's addictive. What happens though then is that through lack of eating and sleeping and regularity in your life, your body starts falling apart, your mind starts racing, your brain goes into overgear, and now you're not functioning at all. In 1995, I had a daughter who was 1 year old and teething, and I had a new baby. And we were living in London and we had come back to Cape Town for the Christmas holiday. So during the day we were racing around, jolting about, going to the beach, meeting friends, having a wonderful time, and at night I was up with the newborn baby feeding and the other one teething and crying. And it became a time of being awake all the time, going completely into overdrive, having had these two babies, one after the other. My physical body was really not particularly strong, and I wasn't being very clever about what I was doing in my life. I became extremely worn down. And just one afternoon, I raced off into the townships, taking my maid home because I thought she shouldn't have to go home on the bus, and I took my two little girls with me, and off we went. And on the way back I suddenly had this panic attack about my friend's father, and I had to go and be with him. And this particular man was very like my own father. He suffers from depression, whereas my father had been bipolar, and when I was 23 he committed suicide. So all of a sudden I had this panic about being with him and going to see him. And I arrived, it was about supper time, I arrived at their house, and already I was behaving slightly strangely because I walked in having left my two tiny babies in the car, which is not something I would do. I'm normally quite a responsible person. So it sounds like maybe it sounds like a small thing, you know, you arrived unexpectedly at an awkward time and you left your kids in the car. Well, so what? It's not a huge thing. But it was just very out of character. And then when eventually my friend's mum brought the children in, I started saying terrible things about them and just in a mood of raving. And it started getting worse and worse. There was no calming me down. And finally they phoned my mum and they phoned my sister-in-law and they phoned my brother, and the two families gathered together around. Lunatic, really. I was bouncing up and down in the road and running around and shouting and saying outrageous and things and screaming and threatening the children. And now it was definitely out of the realms of normal, acceptable behaviour. Nobody knew what was going on. Nobody knew where it had come from or why, and I think they were all absolutely terrified and shocked. I became extremely willful, very strong, very, as I said, outspoken and so on. And they did finally call a doctor who was going to try and sedate me. And they didn't have very much luck, because 1 injection of Valium should have put me to sleep, and it didn't, and 2 didn't, and 3 didn't. I still was jumping up and running outside and fighting physically with people not to calm down. And ultimately it was an ambulance, big burly guys with white coats with straitjackets and stretchers, and into a hospital, euphemistically called sleep therapy. They put me into a padded cell, a fairly hairy experience. And because of sedation, I don't really remember anything, but I do remember opening my eyes, looking at this white room, white wall, observation window, and very quickly closing my eyes again, thinking, I don't want to know anything about this. So I didn't physically hurt myself, and I hadn't been spending or being sexually promiscuous or anything like that, which are the classic symptoms. But it was absolutely disruptive, very out of character. And now, because of the very heavy sedatives, which they have to keep you on for a while, you really go into a horrible half awake, half asleep. It's sort of a twilight zone. Even for two weeks, while you're coming out of being so heavily sedated, you're saying things that are also out of character. You're only half remembering things. It's a really terrible, terrible place to be. And I think that you put your whole family in turmoil. My husband had gone back to London at that stage, so he was hearing secondhand what was going on. And I was supposed to be coming home, and I didn't. You know, the doctors were being uncooperative and wouldn't speak to him, and it was an awful time. However, I went back home and I came off medication quite quickly. And as I said, I was already a complementary practitioner, so a lot of my friends were masseurs and reflexologists, and I was already going to yoga and teaching yoga. I went into that routine of looking after myself and trying to come back to normal. I lost a huge amount of weight. So it was all, eating and making sure that I was building my strength again. I wasn't diagnosed. They just called it a hypomanic attack. There was no ongoing treatment, counseling, post-traumatic counseling. There was nothing. We were just left on our own, like it was a one-off event and, get over it. And it was fine until about 2 years later, when it's usually kind of unpredicted. You don't know why it happens, but just suddenly, season or something. And it's maybe there's an underlying cycle that can be quite useful if you can identify that. For me, it was usually the end of the year. It was Christmas. The children weren't going to school, so there wasn't a rhythm. Our domestic helper would go on holiday. It would be Christmas, New Year, was the anniversary of my father's death. There would be things that happened that would either excite me or wear me out. And slowly I would start, not sleeping and talking too fast and not eating regularly and so on. When my husband found me dancing outside at midnight in the garden around the pool, it was suggested that maybe I went to a psychiatrist. And I think by that stage I'd got a handle on bipolar disorder, manic depression. I knew that my father had it. And I remember going willingly and saying to my mum, they're probably going to diagnose bipolar disorder and they're going to put me on lithium and I'll go into the clinic and, I'll be fine. And on that incident, this was now 1997, 2 years later, I went to a day clinic. It was very nice. They had discussion groups, physiotherapy, exercise classes, art classes. It was a very nice environment. But being a healer, I thought I had to heal everybody who was there. And that's also a common thing. I've spoken to friends and people from our support group that we formed. It's quite common for you, if you're in that field, to suddenly start feeling that you have to help everybody. everybody. It doesn't matter whether you know them or not. Well, of course, I'd spent a couple of days with these people in the day clinic. I definitely knew them and wanted to help them, and I could solve their problems. And again, it was pretty self-contained. I mean, I was in the right place to have a manic attack. I was right there in the clinic. And it was interesting for me because although I had gone outside the realm of behaving in an acceptable manner, there were certain parts that were still very astutely observing what was going on. I knew what I was doing. I was revving myself up. I was stirring up my Reiki energy, and I was going to help this guy that was suffering from obsessive-compulsive disorder. And I was going to help him play the cello like he'd never played it before because he was going to give us a little performance. Well, I had exactly the reverse effect. All this running around and running towards him and, flying through the air and so on did not make him more at ease to play his cello. And I ran out of the room and into the reception area and banged my fist against the wall, and I was absolutely elated that I had done what I had set out to do. Well, you can understand that the psychiatric nurse in reception was freaked out, phoned the doctor, and again I was sedated. But this time I kind of knew I'd lost it a little bit, and I took the pills happily. And right in the middle of that, I heard her talking to the doctor. I thought to myself, isn't this very interesting? I ran out and I banged the wall. I was elated, excited that I had achieved something, feeling great success. She interpreted it as outrageous frustration, anger, rage, that I needed to be calmed down because I was probably dangerous. And so in the midst of all of my own confusion, I had that insight to observe that my behavior was being misinterpreted, which is interesting because what I noticed, and another time as well, was that people didn't ever ask me how I felt or what I was feeling or how I was feeling or are you angry or why are you doing this? No, it's very, very strange, quite extraordinary that they should, observe you and decide what they're going to be doing to you without asking you anything about how you're feeling. And the other thing that is interesting is that you get judged by other people's behavior, and you can become violent and you can become aggressive when you're manic or when you're out of kilter like that. So immediately somebody's classified as bipolar and they start yelling or whatever, the nursing staff must think, well, there's a potential that they can be violent, and so they are terrified. So I can understand it, but what I can't understand is that they don't actually sit down with you and talk to you. They are supposed to be helping you. And it happened in my next situation even worse. But let's just stay where we are for the moment. At that time, I was put on lithium and I did get a diagnosis as bipolar. And I had never really suffered badly from depression. And there was a question hanging around for me that I wondered whether I had been in denial about depression because it was depression that had killed my father. And it was a question that I asked my doctor at one stage, and he said that it actually wasn't really in my constitution to